Welcome to episode 1 of the Intrinsically Ordered podcast. Today, we have a guest for episode number 1. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Episode 1. So I just found out this is episode 1. This is great. So my name is Christopher. From Texas, and we figured out we were going to do this maybe 13 or 14 hours ago.
Yep, last night.
A mutual friend put us in touch because you were having this conversation. I didn't even know you lived in Colorado, and I was coming to Colorado, and I planned on skiing today. It didn't work out, and so we both ended up being free, and so that's me, and that's how I got here. That's a short first intro.
Yeah, that was like I got a text last night, like, introduction from a mutual friend, and then, bam, here we are, not even 24 hours later in person. So that's quite the journey. And today we're kind of going to be talking about that. In a certain sense, I think that your life starts once you come out. When you're in the closet, you think about coming out as almost an end goal, but really coming out is like the starting line for your life. And we'll be talking about that today.
Yeah, I mean, so I came out, I'm 35 now. I came out at 28. And so kind of us just meaning you saying this is episode 1. So, I mean, I remember, when I was struggling with everything, all in my 20s, doing conversion therapy, really struggling with my vocation as a Catholic, having tried seminary a couple times in discernment with the diocese. I was in a religious order for a year. I dated an amazing woman off and on, and that was heartbreaking to have to try to go through that and make things work. Like, that was the ups and downs of my 20s. Finally came out at 28. At the time, you think your life is completely falling apart. And fast forward, right? I know we're jumping like 8 years later, 7 years later, to sitting down and having a conversation like this, like the amount of freedom and peace and joy and like so many of the fruits of the Spirit just like sitting here. With peace and happiness, like in this beautiful fall morning of Colorado, like living a fulfilled life, and a vocation that the church does not recognize, says will only bring me disunity, says that will only bring me sadness, basically like the opposite of the fruits of the Spirit, right? Living out the 7 deadly sins, and that lived experience just not being true.
Yeah, I mean, when you're in the church and you hear about the gay lifestyle, it's this. I mean, when you're in the church, it's hard to imagine your life without it. When all of your friends are in the church, when your livelihood's in the church, when you spend almost every day in church, when your social media echo chambers are all from the church, it seems like coming out, you're going to lose everything, which, like, you do in a certain sense. And I don't really stay in contact with the people that I did a few years ago, and you lose so much. But then you realize, you're resilient, you move on, you build a new life, you build friends that are there that actually support you. Like, when you come out, you figure out who really cares about you, not just the Catholic version of you.
Yeah.
And you can just, I don't know, in the church you worry so much about, like, if I were to leave or say that I don't subscribe to this dogma, I'm going to be struck down or my life's going to be terrible. And then one day you work up the gumption to say, like, I don't know if I believe. And then you don't get turned into a pillar of salt as you look behind at the city.
Yeah. And, looking back at that time, like I had my conversion when I was in 8th grade, and I never looked back, right? Like, I was so into church community. I absolutely loved being in a youth group. Not only was I in the Catholic youth group, I was like in the evangelical and the Methodist youth group. I was giving the retreat talks. I worked
youth group king.
Yeah, I worked at this, the Pines Catholic camp, the summer camp, like every year for like 4, 5, 6 years. After high school, I did a gap year working for Net Ministries, and then I went to the University of Dallas, which is a very renowned Catholic college with an amazing education. I did the study abroad in Europe, fell in love with St. Francis, traveled to Assisi all those times, kept going back to Italy in my 20s. Like I said, I discerned vocation, very involved in the Catholic young adult group. And I say all that because, like, on one hand, like, the community was amazing. Yeah. We felt so alive when we had all the answers, and it's a vibrant community. And for the people that are able to live it, right, because they have the belief system that is aligned, because they're able to behave, there's this, like, I believe it, and I could behave well, and so I belong, right? Yeah. There's that, like, belief, behavior, and belonging, and they're really all tied together. Having all of that is incredible, but even though I belonged and I believed, I could not behave. I felt like I was living a double life. It was a scandal in the making. It's why I never stayed in seminary for very long. I was just terrified that I was going to lead a double life and that I was going to be harmful, right? And in my like deepest journal moments, I felt like a Like I'm thinking back right now to the theology of the body camp that I was at, like the week long, and I felt like a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? Like I think it talks about that in scripture. And so even though we had it all, like it was a facade because we weren't our true selves. And LGBTQ people experience that closet, but a lot of people in the church we find come to us that like feel marginalization in one way or the other. Maybe they're experiencing abuse, maybe they are LGBTQ, maybe it's an issue of like they're feeling racism, or like they have a mental health struggle, or like there's just so many things that marginalize where we feel like if I actually come out with whatever struggle I'm facing, like will I lose all of this? And I think of that scripture verse though, like even though I had it all in the ministry, in the young adult group, and people looked up to me, it was like, what is it to gain the whole world and to lose your soul?
And especially as somebody who's high up in a group, like remember through high school youth group, like I was the guy that all of the old people in the parish looked at. I was the guy that everybody in youth group looked up to. Like there's almost an added pressure where you're not just there, but if you're the model that everybody holds their kids up to. I remember in college I had a friend and his mom came to visit, and I knew how to say all of the right things, and she started comparing her son to me, and it's almost like it's hard to explain to somebody when you are the model of the community. And even though like I wasn't living a double life, I wasn't breaking the rules, it's like, what if people figured out that I wasn't who everybody thought that I was? And then as people start guessing or they talk about topics and you feel that like jolt of electricity going down your spine when people get close or talk about it, that's an experience that's hard to rival. There's something to be said about like talking to straight Catholics about what it's like to be gay in the church, even living a celibate lifestyle, just something that you can't communicate that to somebody who doesn't have any sense for what that even means. Like, do you ever find that you can adequately explain your experience to anybody outside of the church?
Yeah, I mean, my perspective on like people that don't affirm and are able to embrace where I'm at, like, I don't know. I guess even though I'm not living in the church's teaching, I'm kind of way out there now, and I've lost contact. Like, there's still a desire to bridge build because I recognize that like the only reason I believe what I believe and I'm out here on the progressive side, right? Like disagreeing with church teaching is because I am gay, and that is something that despite all of my attempts and the church's attempts to help me change, I couldn't change. If it wasn't for that, if I was experienced heterosexual attraction, never had same-sex attraction, I would probably be married. I would probably be like some youth pastor with a bunch of kids, right? And I would be like grieving this conversation. I would be very sad, and there's nothing that anybody can do to change my belief because I would be behaving well and I would have great sense of belonging and it would all have made sense. And so I don't want to come at it from some like self-righteous, like I'm woke or the church is wrong and here I am. Like, so for those people that just can't come across, like, it's hard. Like, while that is harmful, and it was harmful for me, and like other people have actually died because of the oppression that they've been under and the result of that. Like, the people on the other side were the lifelong friends of mine. They were really kind people. Like, they loved me and they still love me. And it wasn't a homophobia or a hatred like that, love versus hate, or, you're being homophobic. It was just a deep grief that they loved me, and they are very sad that I have chosen this life, and they believe from what the church teaches them in their heart of hearts that because of that, like, I won't have fulfillment in this life and I won't potentially make it to the afterlife. And that is extremely heavy and extremely difficult and extremely challenging. And my husband and I have both navigated that through our 20s of like people in our life that love us that we just bring grief to. And so, and each person that's decided to stay in our life has had to reconcile and grieve that and accept that we're going to live the life that we're going to live. And they just pray that God's mercy is bigger than the sin that we're living. And so there are family members and friends of ours that we've stayed in relationship with. And is it difficult? Yeah. Like, is it different than it always was? Yeah. Is there grief? Yeah. But there's this level of acceptance that I'm not expecting them to change. Yeah. And they have grieved and accepted that I am not changing. And so we're in community there. But yeah, like your experience, the vast majority of those people in my life, like, you've lost, and we grieve that. And there's so many people that haven't made it to the other side that are LGBTQ that are just like struggling of like, what if I lose it all? And I think I'm here and you're here to say that like there is a life on the other end, whether it's priests that we know that have left the priesthood and had to start an entire life, an entire vocation over, right? Whether it's people that were married and went through divorce and annulment and are co-parenting together beautifully. Those things are like these just tragic sob stories in the Catholic Church when we were living that life that you would never, ever think like there's life on the other side. And then we get into our 20s and 30s and we found one by one, whether it's the experience of LGBT or anything else, that like families experience tragedy and scandal and falling out and falling away. And then you find that God's grace like is still there and persists, and you find a way like to have joy in your life. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, I love that.
Your thoughts,
There's, I think everybody that's came out, there's this sense of like regret. So I mean, I came out at 21, and even then, like I feel like I missed out on so much of life because I waited to come out. There's people that come out in their 20s and their 30s and their 40s. I even know of people that came out in their 70s and 80s. And it's this like, you're in the church, you think you're doing something awesome, you're maybe trying to discern what you want to do with your life, but like you will eventually hit this point where you leave and you regret not coming out sooner. Like that's the universal experience, is like you wish you'd came out sooner, because your life doesn't really start until you come out. And I get it that it's hard when you're in it, and I think we were talking about this, that so many people reach out to us about they're still in the church or they're in the process of leaving the church, and they're like, will I have a life on the other side? I'm leaving everything behind. Like, it's going to be terrible. And it's hard to communicate the strength of like, you're going to leave, and a year from now you're going to have awesome friends. You're going to be potentially living in a new place, and you're not going to think that much about the church. Like, you think like the idea of mortal sin and leaving the church, and it's going to be the worst thing ever. And a few years down the line, like, you just don't think about it, no matter how involved in the church you were.
Yeah.
Your brain moves on.
Yeah, and that's not to say that like we don't have like faith. People still ask me like, are you still Catholic, right? And that's a difficult and complicated question, but like, am I still like, do I still love like the life of the saints? Yes. Like, do I still love the Gospels and the way that Jesus came and set that example of loving others, and you know, what's the fulfillment of the scriptures to people, and like reached out to the outcast and the marginalized, and like so much of church teaching like is all about that. Like, yes, absolutely. Like, all those things still motivate me. Do I still worship? Do I still go to church? Yes. Do I go to Catholic Mass every week? No. And then automatically, boom, written off, you're not Catholic. And it's like that, we know that binary thinking like works for a lot of people in every denomination, but there's a lot of us out there that have found our way. It's not that black and white yes or no, that like you're either all in or you're nothing at all, right? Like, these are the teachings of the church, and Jesus founded the church, and if you don't agree with all the teachings, then you reject Jesus. Like, that's literally the thing that Jesus came to confront when he said, I came, like, you know, that they may have life and life in the fullest, and not like for the letter of the law, but like the spirit of the law. And all the religious people like that confronted Jesus were like, you're not doing these things right. And Jesus was meeting people like where they were at. And so like, I still have faith. I still love the church and so much a part of the church. And there are things I've had to let go of that have been really sad and really hard. But there's been things I've been able to take with me. And do I think about my Catholic faith or engage with it every single day of my life? Yes, for sure. But plenty of people would still write off and say, oh, you're not really Catholic anymore because of X, Y, Z. And it's like, was I baptized? Did I receive a majority of the seven sacraments? So yeah, and then one more thing about coming out, like, you and I are both friends with priests in their 40s, 50s, or former priests in their 40s, 50s, 60s, even 70s that like DM'd me on Facebook that are like, I've never like told anyone, right? And to the point where like I don't even want to say this like much more in a public forum because of that. And what would I have done when I was their age back in the 60s and 70s and I was gay and there wasn't a way to come out and gay marriage wasn't legal, right? Yeah. And I said this tongue in cheek earlier that like the difficulty of finding vocations in the church and the church vocation shortage for priests, I think in a lot of ways is because we've come so far with gay rights and gay people being able to integrate their faith and their sexuality and find community and find love and find marriage for those that want it, that like it's given us the freedom to then choose that life and still have a sense of faith, where that like wasn't afforded to people in the church for most of its history. So where would you go? You've already said this, and we know it till we're blue in the face. You go to the convent and you go to the seminary. But that isn't to disparage anyone's vocation that is an LGBTQ person that is in a vocation of the church as a celibate person, because they are trying to follow God every single day of their life. They're trying to live out their vows faithfully, even in that struggle, and they did not have the same privileges that we had, you know, and that should be honored. And treated with like respect, that like they've paved the way by like staying true to discipleship, and being brave in the way that they could, you know.
I think it's beautiful growing up in the church and talking about the beauty of love in marriage, and you see so much in homilies, in youth group talks about how getting married one day, you're going to become a better person, you're going to love, you're going to learn to be a better person, to give more fully of yourself. But then like thinking, well, I'm gay, but so that would never happen if I'm in a relationship with somebody. And then eventually you start dating, and then you're like, everything that the straight Catholics said about what straight marriage would do to you and make you a better person, that happens just as much with somebody of the same sex.
I get chills. Yes. Like, yes, yeah. yes. Yeah, I mean, y'all, like, it's hard not to get emotional. Like, I've been married. Our 2-year anniversary was a couple days ago. And, yeah, I mean, it's incredible. Like, picking up your cross daily, like the self-sacrificial love, like that agape love. Like, you know, we're taught the 3 loves, right? Like philia, eros, and agape. And to have that, like, to love my husband in that sort of like best friend brotherly way, like that was one of the most romantic things after living in the closet for so long, is like, you're my best friend.
Yeah.
You know, like Kyle is my best friend, right? Like that brings me such joy, right? Like that philia sort of platonic love of like being life partners, right? The eros is obviously there, and it was so nice to finally not have to like push that down. And then the agape, like that self-sacrificial love of like constantly apologizing, seeking forgiveness, right? Like employing the Christian teachings that we've, you know, received all these years, like being in community with other like married couples who like come from a Christian background, or practicing Christians who are accepting to us, that we can like lean on as they're trying to live out Christian ethics in their marriage. And then, yeah, I mean, I could go on and on. And yeah, is it hard? Absolutely, for sure. And it's just wild that like there are so many people in traditional Catholicism in my life, or previously in my life, that like are grieved by my marriage and believe in their heart of hearts, not out of hatred for me or like homophobia, but out of a sadness, think that our marriage will fall apart. Yeah. I remember one of my close friends is an attorney. He was a very close friend. He's an attorney, and he does like marriage, basically like marriage law. Mm-hmm. And I was telling you about my engagement when I got engaged, and he basically was like coaching me on a prenuptial agreement. And he was doing it like as a sincere friend, like, have you and your fiance ever thought about that? And it puzzled me, and I'm like, have you ever given this advice to anybody else in our Catholic community? He's like, well, no, if I did that, that would be grounds for annulment. Like, in other words, if you're in a Catholic marriage and you sign a prenup, it's grounds for an annulment, right? Because you're not fully giving yourself. And I'm like, this is crazy. Like, one of my closest friends, like, so believes in his heart of hearts that my marriage to Kyle isn't real. And I asked him, like, in all sincereness, I was like, why would you give this advice to me if it's grounds for annulment for all of our other Catholic friends? And he's like, well, you don't have the sacramental grace of marriage. He was being very sincere, right? Like very almost like naive, like, you don't have the sacramental grace. And I was like, yeah, it's just, and I know so many people believe that, right? But like, the Catholic Church might have a guarantee of grace in the 7 sacraments. Like the Church establishes 7 sacraments. They are a guarantee of God's grace, but it is not a monopoly of God's grace. And that's why I would say the 7 sacraments might be a guarantee of God's grace in church teachings, but it is not a monopoly. And so many traditional Catholics treat it as monopoly. Like, you could only get Christ's forgiveness through confession. Sorry, Protestants. Like, you could only get the fullness of Jesus through his body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist, right? Not those little wafers they give out at the Baptist church. Until you finally go to the Baptist church and you see God's grace working in the little wafer, like, until you go and like are in community with evangelicals or queer people or, you know, like atheists, like, you start to see God work, I mean, in the mountains, right? Like, while I'm skiing, like, all these other ways, like, life is so beautiful and God is so present.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, and I find that when you're in the closet before you come out, you think that it's how do I thread this needle? That being gay is going to make your life super different, that being gay is a super big part of your life. And the church is always like, being gay isn't a big part of your identity. And I found that once you come out, you just have a normal life. Like, you might be gay, but I think less about being gay after coming out. Yeah. I'm just in a relationship. I have a life. Like, gay relationships are the same as straight relationships. There's the same struggles. There's the same awesomeness. There's the same things that couples got to work on. living your life when you're out and proud. There's almost like after you come out, a post-coming out boredom, because you work up in your brain, coming out's going to be this big thing, and then you come out and 3 months down the line, you're just living a normal life, and there's nothing better, there's nothing worse. It's just like, now you can have a normal life, which I find quite interesting.
Like, what we are raised, right? Like, you're a child of God. Your gayness is not your identity. Don't over-identify, right? The irony is that when we come out, then to the church, we are over-identified by that. And then that becomes my entire discipleship, and my entire relationship with God was he has chosen to break with church teaching, right? And there's so many LGBTQ people we know that are still Catholic in so many ways, and still practice their faith in like 90% of the ways, but this one big break, like totally casts them out. And like, that's that over-identification. But you're right. Like, after coming out, like you said, the boredom or whatever, like you begin to live life, and then you have so much more spiritual energy to like live out that sort of ministry passion that we've had of like welcoming people. Like, we serve people experiencing homelessness, like, through charity work. Like, I've worked in nonprofit my entire life. I work full time for a suicide prevention and mental health nonprofit, and like almost all of my coworkers are like Christian, right? In Dallas, where I live. And so like, I dedicate my life to that, right? Like, I have so much more freedom to be there for my family and to like be an uncle to my niece and nephews. And my husband like is devoted to his family, and like he wants to help the world through healthcare. But when I was in the closet, speaking for myself, like, I was doing so much of that work, but there was that terror and that gripping, like, and then when you come out, like, you can't do any of that work anymore, right? Like, I have always wanted to keep fundraising for I love Catholic charities, and I've wanted to fundraise for Catholic charities, but I know there's no way in hell I could ever work there because they're under a diocese, right? And so I'll never apply for these jobs, even though I'm so passionate about all the work that Catholic Charities does, right? Like, they help like migrants, right? Like, they help the poor. They're in disaster response. My 30th birthday party was literally like a fundraiser for the local Catholic Charities, and it was also my coming out party. Whereas the first time I had like people from my Catholic world and pre-coming out and post-coming out, and my family, and like I had Catholic Charities there. But even saying that is like, is that a scandal? Like, is somebody going to hunt them down and find out that Catholic Charities like came to my party? Like, no, they didn't endorse my marriage. They were just there because I was like spending my birthday party like fundraising for them to like be the hands and feet of Christ, right? But because it was my gay coming out, like, like it taints it, and we just know that like that is not the economy of grace anymore in our lives.
And that's where I think that the church is so ill-equipped to deal with this issue, because they're saying being gay isn't part of you, but in a certain way they make it such a big part of you because that's your lens through which you have to navigate your vocation, your life, a life of grace and sin, versus like in the modern conception where in a certain sense you identify as gay, then your life is just normal. Like, it's not a big part of your life. So it's this weird thing that the church makes such a big deal about, and then you're just like, no, it doesn't matter. Like, everything they like, oh, if you're not in a state of grace according to the church's teaching, like, you're not gonna be able to provide for people or sacrifice as much. And I've met way better people outside of the church that are making way more of an impact in the world without first worrying if they're following this old, outdated manual of what they can and can't do. And instead, they're worried about flourishing human goodness, caring for people, these things that sure seems like they have a whole lot more supernatural grace in their soul than the local fraternity parish who's only obsessed about, are you on birth control and are you gay?
Yeah. And it's not like I've lost everybody from my Catholic community. Like, I still have good friends, and to these friends that are like living out the church's teaching, right? That like, I think of one of my best friends. Actually, the whole reason I'm in love with Colorado and I love to ski is because I came out with him years and years ago, and like to experience the mountains, and him and I remain friends. But that was long before I came out, and then I came out, and our friendship has really, really suffered because of it. And he's still living out like the tenets of the church, right? Like, he works in full-time ministry. He's got an amazing marriage. They practice natural family planning. And so whenever I talk with him, like, all of that is great for him. And I like want to encourage them and want to like lift them up and encourage them to like live out church teaching, because it's clearly bearing the fruits of the Spirit in your life. And I know this is a woke, like, my truth is my truth story, but like, that clearly was not working for me after my entire adult life of desperately trying. And so I can't live that up, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to deny it for him or encourage him to keep living that life out, even if it does. So like, the faith does work, and the fruits of the Spirit are there for those people, even if like that life was clearly not working for us and so many others. So it is a yes and in the theology that we were brought up in, there is no yes and. Like, you're either in the fullness or you're out of it. And they think that because I've stepped out, I don't affirm any of that anymore. I think that it's all false. I think that it's all not real. I think that it's a lie. I feel like it's wrong. Like, no, like the kind of progressive in me is a yes and. It's like, if that works for all of you all, then yes, do it. But for those of us that are suffering and not experiencing God's grace and are not able to be a disciple of Jesus Christ in that life, then no.
Well, I always find it fascinating to talk to especially younger apologists or Catholics who are like just getting in, that are starting to hear the Father Mike Schmitz of the world, and they leave comments or they reach out. They're like, the peace is found in the Lord. And you're like, I went to daily mass. I prayed 20 decades of the rosary every day. I went on retreats. I was like all the way in. I was free from all mortal sin. And it's like, I have a friend, and he's a convert to the Catholic Church, and he's trying to talk to me. And first of all, I'm like, you gotta get better apologetics. And I was giving him better arguments than he was putting out.
Yeah.
And I was like, you go to church once a week on the weekends. Like, it's hard to explain to some people that, like, whatever level of devoutness you have right now, I was way further along. Like, at what point would I magically hit this? I'm finally gonna, like, make it work. Because we've talked to priests who've been in ministry. We've talked to monks who've been in ministry, like, as holy as you can possibly be. The question is, like, at what point would this have actually worked for me? And it's always hard to explain to young, zealous Catholics that are just starting to hit kind of the apologetic roadshow that you're like, I tried harder than you did. Like, you can be quiet for a little bit. Like,
well, and so much of what we lived that was exciting for us in our teens and 20s is what a lot of people live culturally in college, in missionary work, and the Peace Corps. Like, that time of our life is thrilling, it's exciting, it's formative, it's communal, and we get outside of our comfort zone, right? Like, it's the college years where you go off and you chart new life. You're studying abroad, serving with net ministry, serving on Focus, serving in the Peace Corps. There's this like self-sacrifice and this like passion and this zeal, like, and that's a beautiful thing for that time in life. And some people could sustain that. Like, some people are like the zealous, sort of focused, missionary-oriented people, or that like pastorally minded person. Like, you think of like the saints, like St. Francis, right? That like lived that missionary zeal their whole life. And then, and you think it's never going to end, and you think it's everything. And we go out with that zeal. And then in your late 20s and 30s, not just the LGBTQ experience, but any other person in ministry, like maybe they're still doing ministry, but then it becomes more of a job. The youth minister, like, you know, him and his wife have the kids, and then they're 2 or 3 kids, and they're like, oh my gosh, we can't afford this. And so he leaves and sells life insurance, right? Yep. Like, I mean, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like, they're living out their primary vocation, like as a husband and a father, to like protect and provide. But you realize, wow, this amazing life of ministry that I thought I was going to, have all those years, like it's not that you become like less devoted to the church. It's just unsustainable to live that level of like passion and zeal. And so I think that that's important to recognize, is that some of this experience we have of sort of like slowing down and trying to be a disciple or trying to follow in the way of Jesus, but realizing it doesn't have to look like it did in our 20s, is an experience of a lot of people. But because we're LGBTQ, like, well, our falling out is different, right? But just to build that bridge with people that aren't in our community, like, they're often experiencing that too. And many of them are a lot of people, like, they experience divorce and they have to go through the annulment process, and they're co-parenting, and they also think that there's life, not life on the other end. And so that's where solidarity and like that bridge building goes, that like our experience isn't unique. The more we are honest about it and open about it, we find that there's so many bridge building between our community and other people.
Well, there's something very dishonest about when you're all the way into church teaching, like, you can't question if this works for you or not. There's a lot of everybody talks about the ideal of Catholic marriage and how low the Catholic divorce rate is. Then you start realizing, like, if you can be honest with yourself, Catholic marriages are no different than non-Catholic marriages, both being straight marriages. They both have the same problems. They both have the same pitfalls. But there's something that when you're Catholic, like, you can't begin to question if the church teaching doesn't work for you, because then you're doubting church teaching. This is the path in which God has ordained for us. And there's a divorce attorney who has a quote that, like, divorce happens slowly and then all at once. And I think in a certain sense, if you can't be honest with yourself, your deconstruction is going to be slowly and then all at once. And I think for me, on the other side of completely leaving the church, I think if I had been able to see it a little bit more complex, be a little bit more honest, be a little bit more flexible with the rules, Like, I think I could have made it work, but in my head, I was like, I got to keep this standard. I got to keep this standard. This has to work. This has to work. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, it doesn't, and my faith broke. But I think people like you, and I'm admire and almost envious of people that can think complexly about the church in the role in their life and be able to think about it with nuance versus I was like an all or nothing. That's what makes so many people so brilliant in the faith, and that also makes leaving this like snapping house of cards, a very rigid faith, can be good, and then it also shoots you out on the other side.
How we do it on time?
Yeah, I've probably got about another 15-20 minutes here.
Okay. About like how it all falls apart. I mean, I'm sort of 7 or 8 years into the public coming out, right? Like 18 is when I like first started the conversion therapy and coming out as same-sex attracted, and I really tried that from 18 to 28 for those 10 years of my adult life, right? My church life started at like 14 when I had my conversion, so 14 to 28, 14 years, right? About 25, 26 is when the cracks were happening. I was really starting to realize this may not work. 28 is when I finally like had the big moment, and then I'm only 6 years into that. Like I am less in the time of being on the other side. So I think for me, having lived sort of more of my adult life in that world, I'm able to like take a lot of it. But it is a house of cards, and that is the way that we built it. And we remember like that phrase, like if you question one teaching, you question the whole teaching, you question Jesus himself. And so it is built as a house of cards. And that's not how a lot of the saints built their faith. That's not how, like, most people in the church's history were not highly educated people, right? Like they belong, they believed because they belong. They were literally born into it, right? And then they like behaved accordingly. But it was built for us as a house of cards, and then it did all fall all at once because it's like a Jenga tower where you pull a couple and then they all fall apart, and then we're left with this like pile. It's for some of it's like a hurricane blows through and just destroys everything, and then you're left and like a damaged house, just like heartbroken, and you're like, can I rebuild? And it looks so damaged, you don't know, but eventually you have to like see the other side. And then I think the work that we kind of do is like FEMA comes in, like we're like, I remember when I was being rescued and I had to put that back together, and it was just like, could not see a way out, right? And then we get those friends in our life to rebuild, and then like, years later. So I fault no one that like can't sort of like re-engage with the church, and it took me a long time. But a really helpful phrase and anecdote, a heretical anecdote, is like, God draws circles, not lines.
Yeah.
And so that box of faith that like, oh, the church has got the monopoly on grace, and it's only the 7 sacraments, and you have to live the 7 tenets of the church to be a faithful Catholic, right? Like this box of lines, or like the narrow line, that kind of thing, is like you're in or you're out, right? Rather than like circles or like that inclusiveness and the overlap there. Like it's so much more of a life-giving way, like for me and so many people in my life to live, and I'm just so grateful that like we have this community in like 2024 with podcasts and DMs and Discord groups and Facebook groups and all these ways that we could come together and like form those circles and like rebuild like what was lost.
I think on that note of a rigid faith, like the worst thing that I think, whether it's parents or friends of people that are might have came out to them, is like if you stay rigid and do this all or nothing, either if you leave the church we're not going to be friends anymore, or people know that beforehand, like those people are much more likely to completely leave the church. Like if they know that all of their friends are going to cut them off as soon as they come out, or you start regurgitating apologetics that you really haven't ever thought through, like you're encouraging that rigid faith, and your friends will never contact you again. And like the people that I stay in contact with from the Catholic world are the ones that have been able to like say, I get that you don't follow church teaching, but we can still be friends. And now the only contact that I have with Catholics are people that can be flexible in that. In a certain sense, like if I were to ever come back to the church, it would be through those people, not through the people that drew this hard line in the sand and that I don't talk to anymore. And so I think especially as parents, like the kids or the people that I know, when they come out, they get kicked out. They don't have relationships with their parents. They get burnt by the church and they never want to come back. But like my mom, who's Catholic, is very supportive of me, and it's like she invites me to church from time to time, and I'll go from time to time. And it's like if you want people to stay in the church, like be a little bit more flexible, because people are on their own journeys. And if you want them to maybe eventually come back around, the way to do that is not by threatening them that you're going to withdraw your friendship completely.
Yeah, and as you were, I could sitting closer, I could see the passion in your eyes of how much it means to have those people stay close to us, and then the heartbreak when we lose them. And I, like, as you're talking, like in my mind is Jesus in the Gospels. When you said not drawing a line in the sand, like immediately I thought, when did Jesus draw a line in the sand? He was with Mary Magdalene, and he said to the religious people, whoever is without sin, cast the first stone. It's like, that's the line in the sand that he drew, right? And he was constantly reaching out to people on the margins that were not the religious people, that were living outside of the faith. And back then, like, he was doing physical healings, but back then, even more so than today, if someone had a physical ailment, it was absolutely a sign of spiritual malady. So back then, all of these things that we now know in this day and age are just sicknesses, like that are just because of germ theory, all these things. Like back then, like the church's teaching in Judaism was that like they have a physical ailment because they have a spiritual ailment. And so when Jesus was coming and healing these people, like in our day and age, you're at a charismatic retreat and you're like getting your back healed or your knee healed, and we're like, oh, that's so cool because you got it injured like in a ski accident. Okay. But back then, like those injuries meant that like God was not looking favorably on you because you sinned in some terrible way. And so when Christ was doing those healings all through the Gospels and reaching out to people, we have to know that like implicitly, like that meant that they were cast out, and he went to them. And you know the Catholic argument, like, yeah, but then he told them to repent and follow him. And yes, he did, but like that didn't mean that he wasn't going to keep reaching out and keep reaching out. And so we have those people like your mom, like, you know, my friend in my life that I've kept through all these years, who's a faithful Catholic, that like they're living Jesus's example to us because Christ knew who he was in the Father's love, and he had such a closeness with God the Father and knowing God the Father's mercy that he can go fearlessly to the margins and proclaim that love without this insecurity of like, well, if I don't say this exact thing, are they going to be damned? And when I think about that sort of like, am I leading somebody else to hell? Like that was the temptation of Satan in the garden, right? Like there's some, you know, the theology, the spiritual writing about like, what was Satan saying to Jesus? It was like tricking him that he screwed up, or tricking him that he led people astray. And he had that faithfulness to just reach out to people, to meet them where they were at, to journey with them, and to know that the Father's love was greater than what all the scribes and the Pharisees were saying when they were drawing lines, and you know, just not seeing that expansive love of God the Father.
And there's also, I think, for a lot of people who might have Catholic friends that are coming out to them, it's like, if that's not your lived experience, like the worst thing you can do is just start regurgitating talking points or talking about it as if you knew what the experience was like. Like I had a friend, and he's recently going through a divorce, and it's like, I'm not married, I don't know what divorce is like, and so I'm not feeding him even platitudes from the secular perspective. It's like, I don't know what that experience is like, so I'm not talking into your experience, I'm not giving you advice, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm going to be there for you, and I'm here to listen and to hear what you have to say. And so I think, especially if you don't know anything about what it's like to be queer, it's like, it's probably an issue that you should listen to people about, that they should feel comfortable talking to you. But the worst thing you can do is say some platitude that you heard in a book, or try to pretend that you know what that's like, because you'll do way more damage than just nodding and saying that, like, I'm there for you.
Yeah. Well, and those arguments that come from people that are like the rote arguments, the platitudes, like the people that, you know, we were raised with, that are sort of devastated by our life choices, like they weren't with me last weekend at the LGBTQ Christian conference in Dallas with an entire room full of people who are like passionately worshiping God. Like they haven't seen a stage full of like 8 LGBTQ worship leaders, and like that can make a conservative Catholic like shudder, almost like it almost makes it worse, right? Okay, fine, whatever. But there are so many people who have never had that experience, like see LGBTQ people like faithfully try to live. I remember when I was on a podcast a couple podcasts ago with one of my old formators, who's like a big author in the space and does this healing ministry, and he was a therapist for 30 years, and the other guy on the podcast I was with was a therapist for 30 years. And as we were having this podcast conversation, he's like, Christopher, I've never met anybody like you, you know? And I'm like literally there are thousands of us all around the country that are trying to find a way to like reconcile our sexuality and our spirituality and still live out like the teachings of Jesus and still follow in the way of Jesus Christ and pray together and worship together, and they just don't know them. And it gets real when I've come out and like on social media, on Facebook, like, and I do my like, 2-year anniversary post, and I write, I post the vows of my like faithfulness to my husband, and wanting to like give my life to him. And I go and I look at the likes to see who from my old world might actually engage. And I don't get likes from any of those people. And I don't know, maybe they saw it, maybe they don't. But then I post a story and I get like 500 views. And I'm like, there are people in that world that are viewing my stories, but they're not in a place where they can like or they see it. And I'm always fascinated. I'm like, am I the only person in your life that's like eking in? And then they're able to say that like, well, I'm the exception to the norm. I'm not like all the others. All the others that are living that debaucherous life or that want to destroy the family. And I'm like, do you know who the others are? Because if I'm the only gay person that you know and I've wanted to stay faithful and I'm trying not to be an enemy of the church, how could you hold your generalization of everybody else when I'm the only one that you know? And that is how the isms work, whether it's racism or sexism or the sort of like homophobia in that sense. I know I've tried to not accuse, but like it's where we have this idea of these people and then we meet one person in the group and then we get to say, well, they're different, right? Like you're not like all the rest of the people of that color or the people of that race or the people of that LGBTQ community when you really don't know that many of those other people. Like, and so rather than saying, oh, wow, maybe it's different than I thought, you just get to keep your generalization and beat up that sort of like metaphorical scarecrow of those people rather than like the person right in front of you that's a witness that maybe it's not as black and white as you thought. And so that person that was interviewing me would be like, I don't know anybody else like this. I'm like, I dare you to stay in touch with me and come with me and meet these other people in my life. But A, they don't have time for it, right? Like they're in their ministry and they're doing their thing and you live in that echo chamber. And B, like there is that fear that like, oh my gosh, if I question this, then I have to question everything. Like those allies in my life, those Catholic allies that like threw out of their love for me, like were like, wow, maybe the church is wrong on this. Like, oh my God, what else are they wrong on? And then, and thankfully for a lot of them, it didn't all fall apart. They're able to say, well, maybe the church doesn't have it right on this thing, but like I can still be a faithful Catholic and engage in the sacraments and live the Catholic life, right? Like I have friends like that too.
Well, I always loved when I was in the church and people would talk about gay people, and it was as if like in my head I always wanted to shout like, though gay people, I'm right here.
Yeah.
Like, and they didn't know they were making these generalizations, they were saying these comments, and like anytime you're in a group discussion about whatever topic, like somebody in that group is not just a statistic. They're not just somebody out there. There's somebody listening.
Yeah.
And I think the thing, there's almost like from people that are like, oh, how come you didn't come out earlier? And it's like, because I listened to everything that you said when we knew each other.
Yeah.
Like I knew that wasn't going to go well. And they're like, no, if you came out, I would have been just fine earlier. And it's like, that's not what it sounded like in every single conversation that we ever had before you knew that. Like if you want people to feel comfortable coming out around you, like say something, because the people in your life who are considering coming out to you are listening all the time to even the slightest phrases, trying to figure out how you would react.
And that's true of so many things. And I know I have to land the plane on our conversation. But like to compare it to another issue. So like, you're in the pews and there's a passionate priest preaching against the evil of abortion, right? And he's a single male, right? Like he's not a woman, he's not married, he's not a father, he hasn't been in that situation, and he's preaching about the evil of abortion, that it's murder, as if there aren't like 50 women in the pews who have either maybe had it, even if they were Catholic, and agree with the church's teaching, but were in a really desperate place and feel horrific about it. People that did it when they were younger before they converted, people that have somebody in their life that like did it. And so he preaches from the pulpit with this naivete of like the evil abortion, them, the baby murders, whatever, as if people in the community aren't there. And so we can do that with so many other issues where we just assume that the people that we're talking about are not the ones in the room. And that's what I would like leave people with, of whatever the teaching is about, like just, not assuming anymore that everyone is in agreement with us and that everyone is living that perfect integrated life, or that they're not all struggling. Like it could be about mental health, it could be about abortion, it could be about the LGBTQ experience, people in marriages that are experiencing neglect or abuse, or they were told that the church teaching is gonna on sexuality is gonna make their marriage amazing, and then they don't experience that when they actually waited until marriage and married the love of their life, and then a year or two they're in and it's not working, right? Like for one reason or another. Like these stories are tragic and we hear them every single day, not just LGBTQ. So just to have that compassion to like meet people where they're at and recognize that like as Jesus exemplified, that like the grace of God is so much more wide and expansive. Divine mercy, right? Like even divine mercy, like that sort of like theology that like whatever the sin is like a drop in the bucket, rather than this huge massive thing that's going to destroy our life.
And I think that's our final note. Like, I've seen a lot of people become religious. I've seen a lot of people leave religion. But the people that stay are the ones that can think complex, that can stay flexible, that can update their beliefs according to the reality that they see. And so it's been great getting to hear your story and what you're up to these days. And I think this is the perfect first episode. Thank you.
Boy, pressure. Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.